And I've titled this From Victims to Victors. Victims to Victors. And I want us to see and understand a little of the process of how a person sees themselves oftentimes as a victim when they're confronted with unexpected circumstances, and at the same time to see a person who overcomes those circumstances to become a victor. And as one counsellor has often said, there are two types of people in this world, victims and victors. And I guess it's a matter of which perspective you come from as to how you view yourself. But there are many in our society today that view themselves as victims because of the circumstances that they found themselves in. Now, I've used this information from a number of sources, but it gives us some insights into how people think of themselves in either way. What is a victim? Have you ever classified yourself as a victim of circumstances? And if so, why? But it's interesting. A victim is a term used to describe a person who has suffered harm, injury, or loss because of an event or a circumstance that is beyond their control. Now, this can include physical, it can include emotional, it can include psychological events, and it can be as a result of natural disasters, can be a result of accidents, of crime, can be through any traumatic event that takes place. Victims often feel powerless and helpless. They may experience a range of negative emotions, such as fear, anger, and sadness. They may also struggle with feelings of guilt, shame, or self-blame, even if the event was not their fault. A victor is a term that's used to describe a person who has overcome adversity, a person who has achieved success in the face of many challenges or obstacles. This can include personal, professional, and academic achievements. It can be the result of hard work, of perseverance, and determination. Victors often possess a positive attitude and mindset and are able to see the challenges as opportunities for personal growth and development. They may also have a strong support system, including friends and family and mentors who have helped them along the way. They serve as role models and examples to inspire and demonstrate that even in adversity, difficulties can be overcome. Now, here in this chapter, we're going to see how the Jewish people went from seeing themselves as victims to victors because of a positive change that had been brought about through people who had a vision, who had a determination to overcome the circumstances and change them. And so it had an immediate effect upon the Jewish population and their outlook. We see the first thing is the timing of the agenda. There's that expression, timing is everything. There are times when we want or expect things to happen right away because we don't like what is happening to us. Other times it requires us to have patience. We're told to wait. And while we wait, that fills us with anxiety and frustration because we're living with uncertainty concerning the future. And none of us likes, if we like to put it bluntly, not to be in control of what we do and how we do it. And when circumstances come in that we can't control, we're at a loss. we're at a loss. And often we focus on those circumstances and what if situations. Now let's just put ourselves, just for a moment, back in the Jewish people's shoes for a moment. If you like, there's a sort of doom and gloom hanging over their heads. Now why do I say that? Because they know the date and the day, and they know what is going to happen. And to this point in time, they're in no position to do anything to stop it. And because of this, the circumstances, they allow themselves or begin to feel like victims because of what has happened to them. They have no say in it. It's been done. And so they see themselves as victims. Now why? Here is their enemies. You put yourself in their place just for a moment. Here you have your neighbour. He's looking at your property. He's looking at all your possessions. He's sizing up what he's going to do to take whatever you have and wipe you out. That was the law. That was Haman's law. And so every Jewish person, their neighbour was looking at them, looking at what they had, looking at what they could get from them, because the Lord said, hey, you can kill them and you can take and plunder everything they have. That was the law. So they're sizing their neighbours up, thinking this will be a good day. I can have a car, I can have this, I can have that. Who's going to stop me? The Lord says I can do it. Wonderful. And so you're walking around and people are sizing you up. Now, also consider the snide remarks. What your neighbour would say to you, hey, you better watch out. It's not long to go now. And guess what? I'm coming to get you. I'm coming to take your land. I'm coming to take your wife. I'm coming to take your daughter. Coming to take all your possessions. And hey, you better enjoy it while you've got it, because you're not having it for very much longer. Imagine walking around every day for 9 months now, hearing all that whispered by your neighbour. Well, it wasn't even whispered. Now, this wouldn't have been just a one-off incident that happened to one Jewish person. This would have been a collective incident that was repeated daily. And at that time, there was 15 million Jews who lived in 127 provinces each day. You can only imagine, if you're hearing this every day, you can imagine the anxiety that is building up as they see the day gets closer and closer. They know what's coming, and they know exactly what day it is. What could they do? There was no government support, no aid. This decree had been endorsed by the king himself. It allowed the people to be murdered, killed, raped, plundered, their properties and possessions all taken, all on the king's approval. And sometimes, when the circumstances of life overwhelm us, we often see ourselves as victim to our circumstances. We allow the circumstances to dictate to us how we're going to respond to the things in our life. And for many people, it's like going through a dark tunnel and you see a speck of light at the end of the tunnel. And it doesn't give you much hope at all. Or as one person observes, Murphy's Law is in operation. Now, for those who follow Murphy's Law, what does that mean? Anything that can and will go wrong does. That's Murphy's Law. So let's imagine you're in that dark, long tunnel and you're looking down and you see this speck of light. Well, according to Murphy's Law, don't get your hopes up, because it's a train that's going to run you right over. So you thought your day was bad, it's only going to get worse. That's Murphy's Law. I'm glad I don't operate under Murphy's Law. But as a victim, everything that can go wrong will go wrong. It happens to you. You feel, I've got no chance, so I just give in to the circumstances. Now, in the Jewish people's case, things took an unexpected change. They began to turn around. Why? Because God had intervened and wanted them to trust him and his infinite resources. And that's what he wants from us. Don't focus on the circumstances. Don't let the circumstances rob you of your joy, rob you of your identity, rob you of who you are in Christ. We have all the resources of heaven, but when we focus on the circumstances, we lose sight of who we are and what our position in Christ is. He wants us to look beyond the circumstances to the one who controls, and is the only one that does control the circumstances. And once again, his promises said he's working all things out, not just some things, but all things he's working out for our good, for his glory as well. So they saw the agenda. It was getting closer. And then we see the appointments. The order of the king had commanded was to be done on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. So what it's telling us here, D-Day was fast approaching. Haman's decree was about to be enacted. The date was set. The goal, eradicate all the Jewish people in the kingdom. Now, this was to be one of the greatest challenges for the Jewish people that they would experience while living in Persia. They had no idea if they would be successful in defeating those people who wanted to kill them. It was pretty frightening when you know that your neighbour, when some of the other people that you got to know on that day were coming after you to take your life and whatever you had. They had no guarantee they would be around to celebrate or to live another day. Yet they were told, prepare for this day. It was nearly there. They were aware of the tension. They were aware of the antagonism towards them by those who are hoping to gain from their demise, who were just waiting for their opportunity, and it was coming quickly. Now, it's hard to understand, but the facts were the Jewish people had come into the Persian kingdom, set themselves up, and as a result, many, because of their business nous, had become wealthy. As a result. And many of the Jewish people kept in their own community. Many of the citizens of Persia looked on at what they had built up, and they did so through envy and were looking forward to taking what was not theirs. They had not worked for them, but they were ready to get what they wanted at the expense of the Jewish people. And we often would say, in our modern economy, keeping up with the Joneses. We would look at what the Joneses have got and say, got a new car, can't let them outdo me, I've got to get a new car. But what if you haven't got the resources? If you haven't got the money? Well, this is the same. They were looking at the Jewish people and seeing what they had built up through hard work. It wasn't a gift. It was through their work. It was through their opportunities, and they had made it. And here were the Persian people saying, how can this be? They were full of envy, and they were determined, hey, we're going to take what you've built up and use it ourselves. And they felt justified in their actions because the Persian government had given the approval. Take whatever you want. Use force if required. So if you give the citizens of Persia this license, then they feel they've got a mandate to take what the Jews had built up. They became hungry and greedy and ready to strike. This was a golden opportunity. One can only imagine the tensions that existed between the citizens of the Persian kingdom, all waiting for the 13th day of the 12th month to come around. They're anticipating it. They had high expectations. Who would come away with the most plunder? Who would be victorious? And so here we have the battleground. It was appointed. The day and the date was there. The assignment, that was the day the enemies of the Jewish people had hoped to defeat them, but that was changed. This was the day the Persian kingdom anticipated. Some with dread, some with anticipation. The outcome of the day would mean extermination as the Jewish people if their opponents were successful, and the treasure and plunder would be theirs for the taking. They would be the victors. And the enemies of the Jewish people had thought they had every advantage. It would be a piece of cake to take whatever they wanted, even if it meant killing their neighbours, if that's what it took. Now it seems, with Mordecai's new proclamation, the tables had been turned. What the enemies thought was going to be a walk in the park to achieve their goals was suddenly changed. They would now be confronted by a people who were not prepared to lay down and allow their properties and possessions and their person to be assaulted without defending themselves. And it's amazing how quickly in life things change. They can look so bleak, they can look so threatening, and yet very quickly things can change in a moment. What seems to be an immovable circumstances with everything looking bleak could be transformed into something with new life and determination for people not to remain victims but indeed victors. The advantage, so the Jewish people themselves defeated those who hated them. No longer did the Jewish people think of themselves as victims. No longer were they allowing their circumstances to dictate what they did. Now they were empowered to defend themselves and deal with those people who sought to do ill against them. Now it's interesting, the enemies of the Jewish people thought they had the right and power to do whatever they wanted, take whatever they wanted without encountering any resistance from the Jewish people. That's what they thought. But thanks to this second decree, the Jewish people were determined to fight fire with fire and defend what was theirs. If their enemies decided they had a legal right to destroy them, then they had the legal right to push back and defend themselves. So in a sense, what we've got, the battle lines have been drawn. If you like, that line in the sand had been drawn and marked. One side would be the victors. The Jewish people had the advantage now that they could defend themselves, and they were prepared to use it against those who sought them to do them ill. The Hebrew language describes the Jewish people on that day as overpowering their enemies. It's a very strong word. So what we find, very simply, is this. What was supposed to be an easy victory, with all the careful planning of Haman and his associates to spring a trap on the Jewish people, was now overturned. And they themselves were ensnared in the very trap that they had set themselves. And they were defeated. What we find in these next verses is know your enemy. And it's very important to know and understand your enemy and his tactics when you are to engage him in warfare. That's part of the preparation. And I put this quote up from Sun Tzu, and it says this: if you know your enemy and yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained you'll also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you'll succumb in every battle. Now, he was a warlord. He wrote the principles, the art of warfare. And that includes the emotional and psychological approach that many armies still use his textbook to engage in warfare. In this case, the Jewish people knew the date of the attack. In this case, the Jewish people knew the objectives, what they were. And so they developed strategies to meet the enemy and thrust back any attacks that they were confronted. Now, to do that, you must understand and know what the enemy's drive, what the enemy's determination, what the enemy's end goals, and anticipate them so that you're not caught unaware by their tactics. Now, as believers in Christ, you and I are involved in spiritual warfare. We're involved against a relentless enemy whose goal is to seek out, to steal, to kill and destroy all those who oppose him using whatever means are available to him. The scriptures tell us all about him and his tactics. But as Christians, we need to understand we are involved in spiritual warfare. And we've been told, put your armour on. And once you've put your armour on, stand firm. That means knowing who you are, knowing who you belong, knowing who gives the victory. You don't do it in your own strength. The assembly, the Jews met in their cities in all the empire of King Xerxes in order to attack those who wanted to harm them. Now, all the hard work that Mordecai had done using the public service, that message was delivered to every one of the 127 provinces. That message clearly was given: you have the right to defend yourselves in the cities in which you live. It's a significant development because it allowed the Jews in every province to meet. So you can imagine what this meant. If there were 15 million Jews living throughout the 127 provinces, if you're a Jewish person, there's safety in numbers. You assembled yourself together with other Jews on that day. Because let's face it, if I'm in a crowd that is intent on taking everything you own and I'm one person, who's going to stop them? But if they come round a corner and they're confronted by a couple of hundred people, they're going to think twice before they engage them in confrontation. Because, let's face it, if you've got one person and you've got a mob, you can easily run over one person. But if you've got to face a bigger and larger group of people, you'll think twice. Because you might be one that doesn't make it through. You might lose your life in it. So, it's a deterrent that was used. They assembled themselves together in every city to do this. And the assertion, no one was strong enough to fight against them because all the other people living in the empire were afraid of them. That makes a statement, isn't it? It sort of tells you the crowd mentality, the safety in numbers. But if you get a lot of people together and they drive one another on, then, and it looks as though it's going to be overwhelming, then people follow like sheep. But you have a group of people that are prepared to stand and defend themselves, well, hey, that's a different story. It's a different story. You might have to stop and say, well, hang on, these people are all on the same page. They're standing in unity. They all are prepared to die for what they believe. And so this is a challenge for us as well. If we stand in unity and we're on the same page, then there's strength in numbers. There's strength going forward. We have a common purpose. And there's many people like that. There's safety in numbers. People think twice. Now, it's a turnaround, and you must ask yourself, why were the enemies afraid of the Jews so suddenly? Because when Haman was their leader, it was a done deal. No opposition. The outcome was guaranteed when he was in charge. But I think there's a psychological impact here of what happened to Haman. Now the people, what happened to Haman? He was number 2 dog in the scheme of things, second behind the king. And what happened to him? Publicly, done. Everybody knew. Bye. They deserted him in his hour of need, and they saw the king had no time for it, and he was publicly hanged by the king as a warning. He was not allowed or prepared to allow this to go unpunished. And so now all these people who had been on Haman's side we're wondering about the balance of power now. Should we do this or should we not? We haven't got the number 2 man to look after us if things go wrong. In fact, the man that was in charge had Haman's position, and he had the king's ear. So, I think there was a lot of people who weren't completely sold on Haman's decree for the Jews. They valued their life more, and they didn't prepare to risk what they had. And that's a challenge for us today in our modern day. As Christians, our culture is changing. Our society is changing at a rapid rate. Our values, our beliefs are under attack. And there may be times we feel that we're victims of our circumstances. And of course, we're going to feel and experience some setbacks along our journey of faith. But the Lord has guaranteed that we'll never be defeated, that those circumstances can change just as quickly, and we can become victors rather than victims of our culture and our society. I'll say this, our society tries to cancel out those who oppose them, but God doesn't cancel out those who belong to Him. The alliance, all the important men of states, the governors, the captains and soldiers, the king's officers helped the Jewish people because they're afraid of Mordecai. Now, it's quite a list here. It's all the Persian government working together to help who? The Jewish people. It's wonderful when you see how a whole government can give assistance to a group of people. And you know what? That's an extraordinary event that takes place for the Persian government to support the Jewish people. Now, why do I say that? Because these Jewish people, they were not even citizens of Persia. Not even citizens. And yet here in this list, you have the top tiers of government. From the PM, being Mordecai, all the way through to every form of government, were bending over backwards to assist the Jewish people against their own Persian citizens. How unique is that? God has a sense of humour. That's all I can say. Our text says they helped the Jewish people. They would do whatever it took to be seen to be supporting the Jewish people. No request was too hard. They received priority assistance for whatever they needed. Wow, fancy having a government or a public servant that's ready to give you priority assistance. Doesn't happen these days much. The reason for this change of heart? They're afraid of Mordecai. Why? They're afraid of what would happen if they didn't cooperate. They'd already seen what happened to Haman. He was the second most powerful man in the kingdom behind the king. He could make life very difficult if they refused to cooperate. He had the power to hire and fire whoever he wanted. And these public servant officials knew it. Another consideration was his relationship to Esther the queen. Remember, she declared she was a Jew, and in 8 verse 17, Mordecai published a second decree that many of the Persian people, they became Jews. It was a favour. It was a flavour. Become a Jewish person. Get in on the action. If you want to be blessed, then become a Jew. Don't hate them. Don't stand against them. Because number 2 man, he's the one. You got to be blessed. Now, it was evident to the Persian population the Jewish God was protecting and orchestrating things. And as a result, they were not prepared to risk upsetting him based on what was happening around them and how the Jewish people were the flavour of the month. Now remember, it doesn't take much to see how certain people are favoured above another. They saw that things were happening in a society, things that they couldn't explain, things that they understood was only through the intervention of the Jewish people's God. They understood that and were not prepared to risk upsetting him. We see the authority as we finish. Mordecai was very important in the king's palace. He was famous in all the empire because he was becoming a leader of more and more people. Now, it was evident that Haman in this whole story had not counted on God having any part in the events that take place. Now remember, he was a superstitious man. He consulted the dices before picking a suitable date to let loose his master plan of exterminating the Jewish kingdom. So he's superstitious. But he also allowed his hatred of the Jews to blind his mind. One of those people happened to be Mordecai. And he just could not understand how Mordecai always seemed to get the better of him no matter what he did. People can't understand that. Now, he failed to consider that Mordecai just happened to be God's man for the event. And because he was God's man for the event, and God had a purpose and plan, nothing was going to hinder Mordecai taking that position. Because God was firmly in control, he was doing things in his own way, in his own time. And that's why Mordecai ended up to be the second most powerful man in the kingdom. He was put in a position of influence. He was put in a position to call the shots in order to deliver God's people. That's why he was there. Our text says Mordecai's fame spread throughout the kingdom. He was a person of importance, and what he said, people paid attention to. He had the king's ear. He was a man who was used to getting things done. Now, if Mordecai said he was going to do something, he did it. Rather unusual for a politician, but he was known for his word. People valued what he said, and they held him in high esteem. So Mordecai's name was being promoted by the Bush Telegraph, because they didn't have Facebook, they didn't have Twitter, they didn't have the internet, but they sure had a Bush Telegraph. And people told people throughout the 127 provinces. So whatever he did, whatever he said, it spread like wildfire throughout the kingdom. He was a person that people could trust. He was a man with integrity. People believed in him. So he became popular. If you like, he was the people's choice for a leader, possibly even more than Xerxes the king. Now understand, this was not something that Mordecai campaigned for. It wasn't something that he really wanted to do, but he was obedient. He did what God commanded him, and the doors were open for him to be put in the place where he was needed to be. That happened to be Prime Minister. Now, it's easy for us to allow the conditions and circumstances of our society to be a concern, even to be a worry. But the truth is, God is in control, and he is not worried by these things. You and I are, because we can't see the future, but God knows exactly what's going to happen in the future. Nothing captures him by surprise, because he has a purpose. He has a plan for every person and for this world. He's pulling the strings behind the scenes at this very moment to accomplish those plans. So yes, we may be experiencing some setbacks. We might be experiencing some circumstances not of our own choosing, not of our own making, but they're working for our good. And we need to trust him. He's placing the right people in the right places to do whatever he wants. And yes, we may be unhappy with what happens to us. But remember, God is in control. He is working things out in our life. In the life of the community in which we live, he's working things out in the life of our nation called Australia. So don't let us allow our circumstances to overwhelm us. Don't allow ourselves to see ourselves as victims of circumstances because they're beyond our control. We know personally the one who holds those circumstances in his hands. We know he's working things out. We need to see ourselves as victors who rise above uncertain circumstances. And that's the challenge. Because tomorrow, more than likely, you walk out this door and guess what? Something unexpected that you never ever thought is going to hit you. How are you going to respond? Are you going to respond as a victim? Poor fella me. Why me? What did I do to deserve this? Why is all the bad things happening to me? Instead of saying, well, God, I don't like it. I don't understand it. But I claim your promises that you're working all things out for my good. I will trust you through these circumstances. Be a victor, not a victim of circumstances. As we close, we're going to turn to 159, just the first verse and chorus as we stand to sing. And may we be able to say, it is well with my soul.